Chapter-wise summary, Bleak House. Chapter 1. Summary and analysis. Chapter 1. On a raw November afternoon, London is enshrouded in heavy fog, made harsher by chimney smoke. Chapter-wise summary of Bleak House. Chapter 1. Summary and analysis. Chapter 1. On a raw November afternoon, London is enshrouded in heavy fog made harsher by chimney smoke. The fog seems thickest in the vicinity of the High Court of Chancery. The court, now in session, is hearing an aspect of the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. A little maid, old woman, is always one of the spectators. Two ruined men, one a shallow prisoner, and the other man from Shropshire, appear before the court. To note avail. Towards the end of the sitting, the Lord High Chancellor announces that in the morning he will meet with the two young people and decide about making them ward of their cousin. Analysis. The first chapter makes Dickens' social criticism explicit and introduces one of the book's principal themes, the ruin that the Chancery Court has made and will continue to make of many people's lives. Court cost and lawyers' fees have already exhausted all the inheritance money in Jarndyce and Jarndyce. The case has gone on for so many years, has become so complicated that no man alive knows what it means. Rather than producing clarity and justice, the court, like much of the working of the law in general, produces a fog and obscure, a fog that creates confusion and depression in which people are lost. The little maid old woman is one of these prisoners, and the Shropshire man, Gridley, are others. The effect of presenting them is to persuade us that Dickens is right. The High Court of Chancery is an institutionalized abuse of the law. Please remember, this is a significant statement, and we need to remember this. It's the Code of Chancery is an institutionalized. The Code of Chancery is an institutionalized abuse of law. The Code of Chancery is an institutionalized abuse of law. Remember this point. It is very, very significant. Okay. Since the two young people, Ada Clare and Richard Carson, and their cousin Mr. Jarndyce, will soon figure prominently in the story, Dickens prepares us for the eventual meeting. The names are not given here. They would mean nothing to us at this point. And Dickens strengthened his attack on the court by implying that the Chancellor, though he is Lord and High, is as usual too negligent and uninterested to be able to recall their names. Chapter 1 moves ponderously, dramatizing the inaction of Chancery and the stagnation of the lives that wait for its decision. There is nothing here to satisfy a taste for last-moving action. To stick with Dickens, we have to adjust to his method, which is to offer a feast in description and in language rather than in rapidly developing plot. Summary and analysis. Chapter 2. Bored to death by rainy weather of Lincolnshire, Lady Dedlock has returned to Dedlock's home in London. She plans to stay there a few days, then go on to Paris. Summary. In middle age, Lady Dedlock retains her beauty and is always attractively groomed. Her husband, the Baronet, Sir Leicester Dedlock, loves her and does not complain that she brought to the marriage neither dowry nor prestige. This afternoon she receives Mr. Tulkinghorn, a rich, close-lipped and secretive solicitor attorney who represents her interest in Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Noticing some legal paper that Tulkinghorn has placed on a table next to her, she takes an interest in the handwriting and asks a lawyer, "Who is it?" A few moments later, she feels faint and asks to be taken to her room. Sir Leicester is surprised but attributes her condition to the stress of a bad weather in Lincolnshire. Analysis. Dickens now introduced two major characters, Lady Dedlock and Tulkinghorn, and a minor character, Sir Leicester, pronounced Leicester. There is continuity here with the first chapter. Dickens regards the world of Idlewild as comparable in futility to the world of Chancery Court, and coincidentally, Lady Dedlock is involved in the Jarndyce and Jarndyce suit. Talking Horn is characterized as rather sinister, Sir Leicester as crotchety and self-satisfied but not vicious or depraved. About Lady Dedlock, we feel ambivalent. She seems rather empty, vain, and restless. But if Sir Leicester loves her, she may have some redeeming features that will be revealed later. The story first bit of suspense appear when she half faints. Summary and analysis, Chapter 3. Eastern Somerset friendliness and unloved is raised at Windsor by her grandmother, actually her aunt, Miss Barbary. After the aunt dead, John Dias, acting through his attorney Kennedy, arranged to have Easter sent to Greenleaf, a boarding school at Reading. After 6 happy years as a student and teacher at Greenleaf, Easter is asked to serve in Bleak House, Mr. John Dye's household. At the Chancery Court, she meets at once befriend Ada Clare and Richard Carson. Like Easter, those two young people have been made to ward of Mr. John Dyes. As they have Chancery, the three counters a diminutive old lady, Miss Flight, who has been deprived partly by the never-ending convoluted John Dyes and John Dyes suit. Analysis. This long chapter introduces and begins characterization of the book's principal figure, Easter, Ada and Richard. Curiosity about Mr. John Dyes is heightened. We wonder why he is so benevolent. To characterize Easter sympathetically, Dickens utilizes the principle of contrast. Either naturalness and good-heartedness are all the more impressive when set against the background of her aunt's dour, unbending Puritanism. Implies in the chapter is Dickens' criticism of his society for its element of cold self-righteousness and its exhaustible harshness towards children. Summary and analysis, Chapter 4. En route to Bleak House, Esther, Ada and Richard spend the night at Jellyby House. Mrs. Jellyby, a friend of John Dyes, neglects her house and children and is obsessed with the projects designed to benefit Africa. Easter is affectionate and helpful to Jellyby children, especially to the accident-prone Pippi and the oldest daughter, Caddy. Serving at her mother's secretary, the badly overworked Caddy is wretched. Summary. Easter, Ada and Richard continue to wonder what sort of person John Dyes is. Richard saw himself briefly one side but remained no distinct impression despite desperate in her impossible home and situation. A tearful Caddy finds solace in compassionate Easter. Analysis. Dickens maintained that people devoted to distant telescopic philanthropy very often shows a tendency to neglect the caring need of those around them, and charity should begin at home. In this chapter, Dickens satirizes Mrs. Jellyby as a type of misguided do-gooder. So this is chapter 4 is significant for the, it's a kind of satire on the telescopic philanthropy. Remember, telescopic philanthropy is a concept, a new concept in chapter 4. And Mrs. Jellyby is one of the prominent figure in this for discussion. Do-gooder. The chapter expertly blends satiric humor and effective pathos. The portrayal of the Jellyby children is another variation in one of Dickens' recurring theme, the vulnerability and suffering of children in a world mismanaged by adults. Caddy emerges as memorable character and comfort, and she, the other children, receives from Easter's strength and a reader's impression of Easter's beautiful spirit. Summary and analysis, Chapter 5. Before breakfast, Caddy Jellyby suggests to Easter that the two off for a morning walk. Ada and Richard join them. After walking a short distance, the four meet old Miss Flight. The somewhat daft but kindly old lady insisted that they see her lodgings. These proved to be room rented above a grotesque rag and bottle shop owned by an aged eccentric Mr. Crook. Crook speaks with the group and mentions the names Barbary, Clare and Dedlock as figures in the John Dyes and John Dyes suit, and gives an account to Tom John Dyes shooting himself in a tavern after the shoot had dragged on interminably. Summary. After visiting briefly with Miss Fly, the young people walk back to the Jellyby house. Richard, already affected adversely by the unending Jarndyce and Jarndyce suit. Nevertheless, state that the suit will work none of its bad influence on us. And speaking particularly to Ada, says that it can't divide us. Early that afternoon, the three were asleep in an open carriage aboard of Bleak House. Analysis. Dickens create crook and his disorder, unproductive show partly as a macabre symbol of the legal system in general and Lord High Chancellor and Chancery Court in particular. The theme of ruinous effects of Chancery is further developed through the presentation of the impoverished Miss Flight and the story of Jarndyce's attempted suicide. Dickens prepared the reader for the story of Nemo by calling attention to the fact that Crook has another renter, a law copywriter. Richard Cartson's attraction to Ada and his distress over the Jarndyce and Jarndyce suit foreshow later development. Summary and analysis, Chapter 6. Esther, Ada and Richards arrive at Bleak House and meet the benevolent self-effacing Mr. Jarndyce. Esther recognizes him as kindly gentleman who shares a stage coach with her 6 years ago. The young people find the old-fashioned house much to their liking. A summary. They meet Mr. Skimpole, a gracious but irresponsible dilettante whom Jarndyce has taken under his protection. Under arrest for a small debt, Skimpole appeals to Richard and Esther. They combine their pocket money to save him from imprisonment. Learning of his incident, Mr. Jarndyce warns the young people never to advance any money whatever for Skimpole's debt. Esther looks forward cheerfully to her new role as housekeeper. Analysis. Having presented the dreary, inhuman and maiden world of Chancery and the equally intolerable world of the Jellybee, Dickens needs to put such disorder fully into perspective. He does so again using sharp contrast. Bleak House and its owner symbolizes the lively contentedness, hope and creativity that prevails when human affairs are rightly ordered. Though the figure of Mr. Jarndyce, Dickens reinforced the optimistic message already implied in the portrayal of Esther. It is impossible for goodness to triumph completely within the individual, and when it does, the individual will naturally seek to rescue and comfort those who are victimized by the operations of false values. To be effective, to make a difference in the world, human goodness requires a sense of responsibility to an active will. Mr. Skimpole, though effusively warm and vaguely good-natured, does not have these qualities. Mr. Jarndyce does. Harold Skimpole's irresponsibility is so extreme that it is dangerous. Thus, Chapter 6 is humorous, but it is also morally instructive. Remember, Chapter 6 is humorous, but it is also morally instructive. Summary and analysis, Chapter 7. At Chesney Wold, the Dedlock estate in Lincolnshire, the reign continues. The old housekeeper, Mrs. Rouncewell, is assisted in her duties by Rosa, with whom Mrs. Rouncewell's grandson, Watt, is in love. Two visitors are admitted and given a tour of the house. One of them is Mr. Guppy, a law clerk at Canday and Carboy. Mr. Guppy notices a portrait of Lady Dedlock and is sure that he has seen it before. When Guppy and his companion leave, Mr. Rouncewell tells Watt and Rosa the story of Ghost's Walk. In Oliver Cromwell's era, 2 centuries earlier, Sir Morebury, Dedlock's wife, once lammed some house intended for a cavalier's fighting against Cromwell. When her husband spied her slipping out to lame his favorite horse, they fought in a stall and she suffered such a severe hip injury that she was painfully lame for the rest of her life. Summary. One day while limping on the terrace of Dedlock's estate, she fell and died, vowing to haunt the terror until the pride of this house is humbled. Mrs. Rouncewell tells Watt to start the tall French clock. He does so, but above its loud beat and the music it played, he calls still hear the footstep of the ghost. Analysis. Gloomy reign in Chesney Wold. The mystery of Guppy's reaction to Lady Dedlock's portrait. The story of Ghost's Walk enhances the reader's sense that misfortune is in store for the Dedlock and perhaps for others. Summary and analysis, Chapter 8. Esther is busy, proud and happy in her role as housekeeping at Bleak House. She lends from Mr. Jarndyce that suit to Chancery counter around a will which at one time involved a fortune, but which is now essentially meaningless because gold coast have consumed the fortune itself. She also learns that Tom John Dias, the former owner of Bleak House, tried unsuccessfully to disentangle the suit and after many years of futile effort shot himself. Summary. Mr. Pardiggle, accompanied by her 5 sons, prays a visit to Bleak House, a charity worker whose zeal unfortunately makes her own sons ferocious with discontent. She describes her activities loudly and at great length, reluctantly. Easter and Ada go with her to visit a poor bricklayer's family who live nearby. Shocked by the squalor of bricklayer's home and disapproving of Mrs. Pardiggle's aggressiveness, the 2 young ladies try to remain as inconspicuous as possible. They stay behind when Mrs. Pardiggle leaves and they want to inquire about a boy who had died in their presence. After making inquiries, they leave but return later to try to comfort the child's mother. Analysis. The chapter helps maintain the book's continuity by returning to the theme of John Dias. John Dias, a legal suit which has been in abeyance for 2 chapters. The introduction of Mrs. Pardiggle thus strengthened Dickens' side theme of satire again, do-gooder, who have never learned that their first obligation is to those closest to them. At once, Dickens contrasts the pretentiousness and emotional shadowness of the professional social activities with the genuine compassion and real assistance of the spontaneous and unassuming young woman as well as poor neighbor woman. Summary and analysis. Chapter 9. Impractical, restless and undirected, Richard Carston is still prepared to obtain a position of any kind. To help him, Mr. Jarndyce writes to one of Richard's distant relatives, Sir Leicester Dedlock, but all prospects of help him seem bleak. Easter, meanwhile, is convinced by unmistakable sign that Richard and Ada are in love. Summary. Old Lawrence Bythorne, modeled very closely to one of Dickens's friend and famous poet Walter Savage Landor, come to Bleak House for a visit. Old Lawrence Bythorne, modeled very closely to one of Dickens' friend and famous poet Walter Savage Landor, comes to Bleak House for a visit. He is an intense human being and a creature of extreme but well-meaning and in fact lovable. So this reference talks about the autobiographical impression of the writer Charles Dickens. A litigious person, he happens to be suing Sir Leicester, whom he disliked. For Lady Dedlock, however, he has only affection and admiration. In connection with Bythorne's legal action, Mr. Guppy arrives at Bleak House. While there, he shocks Easter by proposing to her. She rejects him formally and she leaves greatly discouraged. Analysis. The portrayal of Richard as unformed and somewhat irrational prepares us for his eventually failure. Bythorne contributes to the book's energy, humor and variety in character. He also reinforces our tendency to be somewhat sympathetic towards Lady Dedlock despite her obvious limitations. Easter's response to Mr. Guppy's proposal of marriage confirms our impression of her good taste and sound judgment. Summary and analysis. Chapter 10 and 11. Not far from Chancery Court stands a lost stationery store owned by Mr. Snagsby, mild and timid. Snagsby is married to a vehement woman. Their one and only servant is Guster, a young woman often afflicted with fits. Summary. One afternoon, Mr. Tuckinghorn visits the stationery shop and asks Snagsby to identify the handwriting of certain Jarndyce and Jarndyce affidavits. Snagsby tells Tuckinghorn that the handwriting is that of Mr. Nemo. Nemo is in Latin for no one, who lives above the rags and bottle shop of Mr. Crook. Tuckinghorn goes to Crook's place and finds Nemo dead, apparently of opium poisoning. Shortly thereafter, an inquest is held. From Little Joe, the street crossing sweeper, Tuckinghorn learns that Nemo was a kind and considerate person. Nemo's death is ruled as accidental and the obscure man is given a pauper's burial in dismal, neglected churchyard. Summary and analysis. Chapter 12. The Dedlock returns from Paris, prepared Chesney Wold for guests and then entertains them. Still, however, Lady Dedlock is born. Summary. One evening, Tuckinghorn brings news about Python's legal action against her Leicester while the lawyer is there. Lady Dedlock thanks him for sending her message about the handwriting, then caught their interest earlier. When she hears about Nemo's death, she insists on hearing the whole story. She pretends to be only casually interested by taking on, sees this only a depiction, analysis. In the next B and their maid Guster, Dickens again shows his penchant for oddity, caricature and grotesque. Like other Victorian novelists, Dickens gives far more attention to such minor characters than is demanded by the plot. Such generosity in creation was more acceptable to Dickens' reader than to today's. The Victorian H.G. Cole was less hurried than our, and in any event it took more delight in reading. The main plot develops further, and as Stackinghorn intensifies his interest in the legal handwriting and in Lady Dedlock's curiosity about the copyist Nemo. The ridiculously conducted inquest continues Dickens' disdainful satire of legal institution and procedure. The same satire is conveyed by the tone which Dickens adopts when he depicts the legal stationery items sold in Snacks Buy's shop. So here we add from chapter 1 to 12. The summary is being read by Dr. Anju Gurawa. Please look into these chapters, and somewhere if you feel like keep us, you can take screenshot also, and you can reverse it, read the audio again, listen it again, and do good in your exam. All the best.